All right, welcome to another Pro Football Doc podcast. A different episode today. You could say that we purposefully don't have a special guest, or we have a very, very special guest. Mr. Paul Revere will make a featured appearance, so to speak. The title of this podcast, Part 1, because we have so much to talk about today, is Paul Revere, not the British, and I will explain that. We've got lots of good guests coming up in the near future. I put off Marcellus Wiley. He was on vacation anyways. Coach Norv Turner is coming on. Jeff Garcia is coming on. A whole host of other people. So don't worry, we'll get back to the guests. But this week, there's just too much to cover. From some of the HIPAA controversies that are out there to the 49ers medical woes and what a medical staff really is or isn't responsible for versus what they get blamed for. And we'll go into that in great detail. And then the NFL versus NFLPA controversy about off-season workouts at the facility, not the financial ramifications. And then part 2, we've got a lot of different things. The exciting news about Outkick and Fox, a vaccine controversy that's real in the NFL. And a lot of different rundowns on different players, including Dak Prescott, some great video, DK Metcalf, what happened here video, and the entertaining part 2 as usual. But part 1, the meat of it, let's talk a little bit here. Some of you that follow along may have heard me say, I'm Paul Revere, not the British. And what I mean by that is, I actually said that once to a general manager. It has to do with misperceptions. Every Monday morning when I was working in the NFL with the San Diego Chargers, after seeing players on the field, on the sideline, in the locker room after a game, the next day after an MRI, I would go look at video, but then I would go meet with the general manager and give him the report. And depending on the general manager, many times I was always the bearer of bad news. And sometimes I would get the blame, right? Because I'm the guy. And that's where literally one time I said, look, I'm Paul Revere. I'm not the British. I'm just telling you the injuries are here. I didn't create the injuries. The British are coming. I'm just telling you they're coming by land or coming by sea. But I'm telling you that the British are coming and this is how they're coming. This is the injury. This is what we have to deal with. The medical staff, myself and the athletic trainers, didn't create the injury. So I think that's one of the big misperceptions from GMs that I've dealt with, because it's natural, from fans of teams. And quite honestly, for me on Twitter, a lot of times I will, as you see this offseason, we've delved a lot into baseball and basketball and other sports. And especially when it's a fan that doesn't realize what I'm doing, I kind of get the blame. Why are you saying towards ACL? What do why are you delivering the bad news? No, I'm just giving you my impression. I'm being Paul Revere, and I think there's a big distinction about that. So before we get into talking about the 49ers medical woes and the NFL and NFLPA controversy, I wanted to go over a little tweet here just to make sure that we're on the same page here. Michael McCann Sports Law, he's talking about HIPAA. Are there legal angles here? So people are talking about medical privacy, etc., especially with draft picks. And Michael McCann, who we've had on the podcast, etc., says that, and remember, it's HIPAA, not HIP, 2 A's, not 2 P's. Many people get it wrong. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Journalists are not under this. They're protected under the First Amendment, and HIPAA never included journalists, so they're allowed. So why am I allowed to talk about the injuries? I don't even call myself a journalist. I'm a medical analyst, okay? So do I enjoy journalistic protections? I don't know, but the reason why I can talk about it is on here, HIPAA applies to only medical professionals involved in a case, not blanketly all medical professionals. If If I'm not involved, it doesn't prevent me as a physician to give my thoughts based on publicly available information. That's why I always say insider knowledge, not insider information. And indeed, Mike McCann, the attorney, said, great point, and agreed with it. So for all the people out there, once and for all, what I'm doing on Twitter, social media, for Outkick and Fox Sports Radio and Sirius is completely legal, as long as I'm dealing in publicly available information, as opposed to revealing secrets from a situation that I have medical information on from treatment, unless I get, permission, of course, which, we have done, and that's good. So let's move on with all that. Eric Branch said 2 years after the 49ers fired their head athletic trainer and strength coach, after a couple injury plagued seasons, still had an NFL high 32 injury reserve this year. You all remember the 49ers are really beat up. And the interesting thing is the 49ers head athletic trainer just got hired in Jacksonville. Trent Baalke hired him. Good guy. My point is, it's easy to blame medical, but that's not the whole story. It's not that simple. First of all, you have to understand memory bias, right? What you see is the 49ers have been injury plagued, and most fans are feel like their team is injury plagued. People only remember the negative. For example, just like people always think positively. I always get a kick out of the beat reporters across the league, and I'm not being critical. They make preseason predictions as to what the record will be. Well, it has to be 50-50, right? It has to add up to the same amount of wins and losses across the league, right? But the average turns out to be 9-7 instead of 8-8, right? Because there's just bias about your team, even if you're trying to be objective as a journalist. Fans are biased. I remember when we had great stretches of good luck with injuries, and some of it, there are other factors, and we'll get into that. But then as soon as you have bad luck, I saw this week people said, well, you were talking about the 49er injuries. You at the Chargers had horrible luck with injuries. My last 5 years, we were really good. As soon as I left, we got some bad luck. That's not because I left. I'm just saying luck happens, etc. But it's memory bias. And the 49ers here, they remember all these people with failed ACLs that came off ACL surgery, like Marcus Lattimore, that never worked out. Or some of the 49ers have drafted a lot of injured players. Look, I thought this was funny headline. Jags Baalke shocking nobody, drafts 2 players who tore ACLs this year as he's the GM for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's continued trying to get bargains, medical bargains, so to speak. So it's easy to blame medical, and there's memory bias. But remember, often medical is just the Paul Revere. We're just telling you the injuries here. We didn't create the injuries. Now, if you want to blame a medical staff, physician, and athletic trainers for not rehabbing a guy well enough, not returning him to play quick enough, I think that can be valid depending on the circumstances, right? But you have to take a look from the inside. It's very hard to judge from the outside. Was this just said to be a mild hamstring strain, and really it was a grade 3 severe, and that's why it took longer? Or was this a severe hamstring strain, but that got back in 4 weeks, and they did a great job? Meanwhile, fans are saying, why 4 weeks? Why so long? So you have to look from the inside. But factors in injuries are, no question, prevention, and that's more the strength and conditioning staff. But a lot of times the strength and conditioning staff is focused more on performance than injury prevention. And maybe that's something that can be improved. It depends on player selection. If you're reaching in a draft and drafting players that are already injured or have been downgraded by medical for their medical grade, like we've talked about in the draft for certain players, then that player gets injured. Is that really on the medical staff, or is that on player selection? Now, I'm not saying it's bad to take a chance on a player that has an injury history or injury propensity, because maybe you're getting a bargain. Like the 49ers a few years ago chose Marcus Lattimore. He never really played. It didn't work out. But in the fourth round, maybe he was a bargain if he did. So I understand that. But player selection plays into it. Pre-existing injuries and patterns play into it. The style and scheme play into it. The style of a player. Is he a tough inside runner, or is he a speed guy to the outside? Depending on the injury, it can affect him more. And injuries beget injuries. And scheme. Certain schemes create more danger for certain players. And also talent and depth. I've often said injuries beget injuries. So what happens is, let's say you have some defensive backs that are injured. What typically happens is then the backup starts to get, let's say the starter's injured, the backup starts to get double duty. So the backup used to be playing a dozen or 15 or more special teams plays in a game and seeing spot duty at dime or otherwise, let's say at corner. Well, now he's seeing 60 plays at corner or 70, still doing special teams 15 plays, running multiple reps in special teams and starting defense, and sometimes still scout defense at practice. And there's fatigue, and depth becomes an issue. I've talked about before offensive linemen. Backups are backups for a reason. They're not as good. So backup offensive linemen tend to dig in and hold on for dear life, whereas starting really top offensive linemen continue to move their feet. And moving your feet leads you less vulnerable to friendly fire or other injury where you get your leg, knee, ankle rolled up on because you're dominating the block. So injuries can beget injuries. We talked about fatigue. Playing conditions, we talked about last week. Carolina making it turf instead of natural grass. Turf has a higher rate of injury. So are the Panthers medical staff now going to be blamed if they get one or two more ACLs or high ankles on the home grass, which is no longer grass, which is turf? And the biggest factor, of course, is luck. Look, I've told you before, I don't like injury prone, but there are injury patterns in injury situations that are predictable, but injury prone is not something that I love. And the bottom line is, anytime you try and blame one thing, it's just usually multifactorial. In order for me or anyone to judge which athletic training or medical staff should be fired or retained, you'd have to look case by case and really open up the medical charts and then see what happened to really give them a good judge. From the outside, it's very hard to tell, very easy to assess blame, and that's why I say Paul Revere, not the British, in terms of what that is. I'll give you another example. We talked about on Pro Football Doc in the preseason injury report, Jerick McKinnon last year for the 49ers. And this is the year before. And we talked about how we thought McKinnon was going to be the worst of the 49er running backs coming off of ACL. And obviously he had some complications and further surgery and didn't really even play that year. But then I saw in comments fans saying, well, that's the 49ers medical staff and they're to blame. Well, it depends. Did the 49ers team physician even do the surgery? Or was this farmed out, or the player went elsewhere? Did he rehab elsewhere, or did he rehab with the 49ers? So until you know all the facts, it's really hard to tell what the issue is. All right, so we're done with Paul Revere. Thanks, Paul, for coming on, so to speak. Just kidding. The other big topic I wanted to talk about in this first segment is the NFL versus NFLPA. Boy, that degenerated quickly, huh? Now this big fight about stay away from camp, come to camp, the whole deal. And here's an unfortunate byproduct. So the NFL put out this memo saying that injuries stay sustained away from club facilities, saying that the team didn't need to pay the salary. Now, here's what I would say about that. That memo says nothing new. That has always been the case. And that is what was agreed upon in the collective bargaining agreement between the Players Association and the league. In all fairness, players have always had the right to stay away from voluntary off-season workouts and team activities. That was their bargain right. But owners and teams always had the right to withhold salary if you got injured and couldn't play in the regular season away from the facility. That's nothing new. This Juwan James controversy where he tore his Achilles, the Broncos right tackle, what he's undergoing is nothing new. The NFL did not invent this rule to get back at players who were trying to stay away in an organized fashion. The players, whether you got organized yourself or not through the union, always have had this right to stay away without penalty, except if you get hurt. Now, by the way, if you get hurt away from the facility, like Juwan James, not only do the Broncos have the right to not pay you if you're not ready for the regular season, they have the right to not even take care of you medically. They don't even have to pay for your surgery. They don't even have to pay for your rehab. Now, players all have private medical insurance, just like their families do through the NFL. So Juwan James, A, he can afford it, but B, his Achilles tear will be covered. The question is, do the Broncos pay for it, or the Broncos say you have to use your own insurance to do so? It would be the Broncos' right to say use your own insurance to do so. That's how the rules work. Now, is it fair? Is it right? I think we can make that argument. Are the players getting screwed? I think we can talk about that. If I were an owner, certainly, of course, you want players to work out because on their own, because the OTAs aren't completely comprehensive and they didn't start immediately after the end of the season. So you want players to work out on your own. So I get the feeling of the public saying poor Juwan James, especially with the fact that he's unlikely to return this season. Look, Mike Garafolo reported, I think through his agent, that he's hopeful he won't miss the entire season. Yeah, I think that's true. Always be hopeful, and it's good to have optimism. But he isn't going to be ready till very, very late in the season, if he's lucky. And will he be 100%? I doubt it. Will the Broncos even activate him, even if he says he's ready to go? I think it'd be very easy for the Broncos to say, we don't think you're 100% and we're not activating you or passing you on a physical yet. Thereby, you can't even get back some of your $10 million salary for the last month. And the Broncos at this point do not have to pay him. You have to understand, Juwan James is very, very unlucky. He was at the facility working out, then listened to the union, and then left. And now he's tore this Achilles. In a normal year, without this consternation, in a normal year without the Broncos getting a new GM in George Patton, look, he still might get paid. I've been involved in situations with the Chargers where a player, I won't say who, I didn't ask him permission, who was injured away from the facility, literally wrestling his little brother. And the team covered it and said, well, we're good. And kind of because it was a player that was a great player, long in the fold. The team was loyal to the player. Not a big deal. Paid for the surgery. Never any issue. Salary issues going forward. But it's also the team's right, if you're injured away, to not. And I think Juwan James is very unfortunate. He was in there, and then he left because of the union stance. And then he gets hurt. And remember, he's only played 3 games in the last 2 seasons. He opted out last year, which is his absolute right. So he pushed back his $10 million salary for a year to this year. And now he's unlikely to get it. Now, he only played 3 games the season before. So he was a big free agent signing for the Broncos, but not for this GM. So now you have a new GM who sees a big contract, who sees this kid has only played 3 games in the last 2 years or whatever it was. And now there's a way to get out at $10 million in terms of the cap. I think it's a very unfortunate situation for Juwan James, and don't know what the solution is. In any case, nothing's changed here. This isn't new. This is just typical NFL and NFLPA back and forth. For every action, there's a reaction and so forth. Right or wrong, this is what the CBA was agreed upon, and this is kind of where we sit. Interesting to me that, first of all, that mini camps were this weekend, many of them, rookie mini camps, and it was essentially 100% attendance, which not surprising, right? Your first day at school, you're not going to be there. I mean, you want to impress everybody. Your first day on the job and you're not going to be there, even if it's voluntary. I mean, you're going to be there, right? Because you're trying to win a job, especially the rookies and the young guys. And I find it interesting, there was a report that over 50 Patriots players have been at their off-season training activities. So it's still individual. I also find it ironic and interesting that Tom Brady apparently was delivered an impassioned 6-minute speech to fellow players to push the boycott and to try and modify off-season workouts. And that's his right. I just find it interesting. I mean, Tom Brady, when he joined, admittedly, he was new to the Buccaneers, but last season, Tom Brady was the guy, and kudos to him because it worked out for him, that gathered players against the direction of the NFLPA during the pandemic and worked out at local high schools because he didn't know his teammates. And he gathered players last year in the heart of the pandemic. And this year, I get it, he's won a Super Bowl and he knows his teammates. And the Buccaneers, as we talked about, have basically returned everybody, basically, which is unprecedented for any team, much less a Super Bowl winning team. So there's familiarity, and now he's saying, let's change the rules and let's not go to the OTAs, and an impassioned plea not to. Well, what about all the quarterbacks that have changed teams? They're wanting to show up, right, and do stuff. So, more power to Tom Brady, but this smacks a little bit of, if I make the basket, it's winners outs in basketball. And if you make the basket, it's losers outs, right? I mean, which side of the coin are you on here? So I found that a little bit ironic. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. It was worthwhile. A deep dive topics that I love to do every now and again for the football faithful, etc. We'll come back after a short break with part 2, where we're a little more lighthearted. We'll talk about some of the changes upcoming. We'll talk about, I think, another very important topic, the vaccine controversy, which is brewing. And I think this is a big deal. We'll analyze the pandemic in terms of injuries. There's some data that's come out. We'll talk about a pandemic first, some more ironic things with Nick Saban.